Okay, so today's presentation is targeted grazing for vegetation management and landscape enhancement. Today we'll be talking about targeted grazing and endangered species. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Marc Horney, who's facilitating the discussion of our guest speakers. Marc is a faculty member in the Department of Animal Sciences at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. He's one of the keystone members of the Targeted Grazing Committee. He's trained as a ruminant nutritionist and an ecologist, and he specializes in domestic and wild grazing animals. He works a lot in monitoring strategies on rangelands and has a little bit of a specialty in remote sensing. His background is in working as a cooperative extension specialist in livestock and natural resources in a couple of our neighboring states. And he was formerly the Area Rangeland Management Specialist with NRCS in California. So just a quick message on some of the sponsors for these workshop series. I'm here with the University of Idaho Rangeland Center. We're also supported by the USDA ARS, Northern Great Plains Research Laboratory, the Texas A&M AgriLife Research and Extension Center out of San Angelo, and also the American Sheep Industry Association. So we thank our sponsors for this workshop. Just a little bit of background on the Targeted Grazing Committee. We welcome you. The committee is a committee within the Society for Range Management, made up of practitioners, land managers, people from all over extension and academia that have a shared interest in targeted grazing. The goal of the Targeted Grazing Committee is to promote the professional development of our members and also the general public so that we can continue an effective stewardship of rangelands. So you can access information about the SRM on the website below, and then our committee has a website as well, which is targetedgrazing.wordpress.com. You can go there for lots of information about targeted grazing and also a repository of all of our archived workshops and webinars. Just a few bits about what we do. The online workshop series is posted online after each session. The workshop series has been ongoing now for about, I think we're in our third year, so we've got quite a few archived on the web. Also, the committee is working together on a joint scientific paper for publication. We work in trying to get information out to the public, so we have a Wikipedia entry that we maintain. We also have a YouTube channel, which is where we post all of our recorded videos and presentations from professional meetings, such as what we have presented in the past at Society for Range Management. You can also check in with us over social media. We have an Instagram account and I believe a Facebook page, but also good old email works if you want to try to reach the committee, and that's targetedgrazing@gmail.com. There are some continuing education units available through the Certified Professional in Range Management, also known as the CPRM. We can get you hooked up with those if you complete a form online that lets us know that you're interested in getting access to some of those, and we can send your name to the SRM to get you accounted for those. This is just a quick overview of some of what we'll be working on the Targeted Grazing on the Ground series of this fall. So we've got one under our belt. Today's is focused on livestock and endangered species, and then we've got one each month through February. More information about those will be posted on our website. Again, our website URL is at the top there, and you can see that we've got quite a lot of information available on that page. So if you have any questions, please feel free to direct it to one of the members of our committee. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the presenter role over to Marc to get started with our session today. So Marc, hold tight. I'm passing.
All right. Should I be seeing something, Lavana?
Yep.
All right.
It might just take just a couple moments, but click on your Join Me menu bar and see if you can see something. It says I'm waiting.
Going over.
Take it.
Yep. go. Great. Okay, so is my desktop now apparent?
Absolutely, yeah.
Awesome. Great. Okay, then let's take it away. Well, welcome everyone to this session of the Targeted Grazing webinar series. Today the plan is, of course, to talk about grazing and dealing with threatened, endangered, and sensitive species. So this is an area of active interest and a lot of growth among those who are working with livestock. So I'm going to speak a lot from the context of California. We have a few endangered species in California that we're dealing with. Every state has some endangered species on rangelands that are of interest. But California, we like to pride ourselves in being really close to we're ahead of Alaska or Hawaii in terms of the total number of animals that are endangered species, and we're well behind them in plants. But we're holding our own in terms of how many threatened and endangered plant and animal species there are in this state, and quite a lot of them are rangeland species, and so we deal with them a lot. And I'm assuming that everybody who's on the webinar today has one of a number of different potential interests in it. So there are people who own ranches and farms and grazing operations that have endangered species that are endemic to those locations and are having to figure out how to manage for the habitats of those species in the context of a larger economic enterprise that's going on. And of course we've got quite a few other people who have seen potential in using livestock as tools for managing the habitat of endangered species or threatened species, or we'll talk about special status species as well. And so there's a lot of interest in how to do this. So what I've decided to do is I've picked a couple of people who I know in the state of California who've got some experience working with both grazing animals and endangered species in a variety of different contexts, and I just invited them to come in and talk for a little while and explain the kind of projects they've been working on, the sorts of challenges that they've faced, and some of the resolutions that they've been able to find as they are working through the process of figuring out how to use grazing animals and targeted grazing practices to specifically either avoid conflict with those species or improve the habitats for them. Okay, so the basics are threatened, endangered, and sensitive species are those whose populations or habitats are at risk. The endangered species are ones whose populations are most at risk. Threatened are right behind them, and sensitive species are generally characterized as being those species of plants and animals who are appearing as though they may be running into difficulty in the near term. So all of them are requiring some level of protection. The endangered species, of course, receive the most. Targeted grazing methods. They have been found in some cases to be useful for either avoiding harms to these different species, or they certainly have potential in certain circumstances to directly enhance their habitat conditions. In terms of doing this successfully, it really depends on learning as much as is possible about the species in that particular landscape and what their needs are. There is information about many of these endangered species and threatened species and special status species, but almost in every case, what we know about them and their responses to the kind of landscape and vegetation and habitat alterations that grazing can be used to produce is still not perfectly well known. And so as time's going on, and every year there are quite a lot of publications coming out discussing the impacts of grazing practices on some of these threatened endangered species. Certainly one concern that I have is when people discuss the effect of grazing, we've got to be really careful to make sure that we are really clear about what we mean by grazing, because there is no single thing called grazing that has some kind of a universal effect on all habitats and all plant and animal species. So it's really careful to be thinking in terms of the numbers of animals, the types of animals, the stocking rate, the season of use. All these things from a targeted grazing standpoint come into having direct effects on what kind of impact this grazing practice is going to have. So one reference. Now, I've posted a number of publications that are guidelines for grazing in or grazing for the benefit of several endangered species that we have in California, and Levina passed those to you, so hopefully we'll be able to get those set up here online shortly, and you guys can have access to them. One of the publications that I put up there is an article that was written by Sheila Berry with the California Cooperative Extension System. She's the County Director and Rangeland Advisor in the San Francisco Bay Area. Because the San Francisco Bay Area folks have a great deal of interest in the environment, and there's a lot of use of open grasslands that surround the Bay Area, there's been quite a lot of public controversy and discussion about the good and the bad of grazing, particularly because there's also quite a few endangered species around the San Francisco Bay Area. And so what Sheila did in her article is she went back to some recent publications from actually I put the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually, and she pointed out that for a number of species that are endemic to California, so we've got vernal pools, which include fairy shrimp, tiger salamanders, a number of other small crustaceans, and a number of plants, that grazing had been found across a number of research projects and local projects to have at least benign effects, in a number of cases actually very beneficial effects to the habitat structure and to the populations of a number of endangered species. So in California, some of the publications have included red-legged frogs, tiger salamanders, kit foxes, and a number of butterfly species, as well as some herps, so the blunt-nosed leopard lizard, kangaroo rats of a couple of varieties, and then getting into the several plant species that have been shown to have some benefit from grazing. Now, I will say that in the context of California, one of our biggest ecological challenges is that California had been some long distance time historically a perennial grassland. Since California was colonized by the Spanish, we had annual grasses from the Mediterranean introduced into the state, and they've dramatically changed a lot of ecosystems. And many of these plant and animal species are being impacted by the spread and the proliferation of these annual grasses. And in a lot of their cases, it's commonly the grazing practices and how you apply them that can be used to suppress some of the annual grasses that are actually the greatest value and benefit to some of these endangered species. Yeah, so my last slide here. So vernal pools, red-legged frogs, tiger salamanders, and kit foxes had all been shown to have some benefit from properly applied grazing practices. So with that, that's kind of the background. I really would like to spend most of the time in this seminar talking to some people who have actually been doing some work with endangered species, and I want to make sure that so if you have a question you want to ask of any of the guest speakers today, please feel free to pop on and post a question on the webinar online so that we can bring that up and talk about it. And at any point you have a question, feel free to just type it up, and we'll see if we can work that into the conversation. So the first person that I'd like to introduce today is Katie Tierney. She's a range and plant scientist with the Outhouse and Mead Incorporated, which is an environmental consulting company here in the Central Coast of California. And Katie's got a couple of different things that she has the ability to talk about, but I thought we'd open it up with a tar plant species that's found down on the Santa Barbara coast. So Katie, are you out there?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Good.
Okay,
Great to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it was good to have you here. So can you open this up by kind of giving everyone a bit of a context about this particular plant? Tell us a little bit about it and where it's located and what some of the concerns are about it.
Yeah, that'd be great. This is, as Dr. Marc mentioned, we're talking about Gaviota Tar Plant. It's a rare species in California, and it's a pretty localized distribution in western Santa Barbara County of California. So it's kind of right along the coastline. For those of you who aren't really familiar with the Santa Barbara location, it's primarily associated with needlegrass grasslands that are dominated with Avena species, so like the wild oaks that we have out here, and those are annual grass species. And there's occasionally associated with purple needlegrass, which is one of our perennial bunch grasses out here that's a native. So it occurs in habitats where we are primarily managing for native perennial grasses as well. Mostly it's pretty limited to just moraine terraces, pretty close to sea level, like up to about 200 feet is about as high elevation as you'll find it. You find it mainly on like acidic, fine, sandy loam soils. So it's really limited in its distribution. So wherever you find it, you need to try and manage for it. It primarily is a disturbance regime, so it likes to have disturbance. So on some of our sites that it used to occur on, and has now been outcompeted by a lot of the introduced annual grass species that are kind of dominating a lot of our rangeland sites, especially in the coastal areas in Santa Barbara County. So the one site that we're working on right now, we're trying to manage for this species, is right on the coast in Santa Barbara. And it's about a 6-acre project site where Gaviota Tar Plant occurred historically in really high numbers. And we went out probably about 10 years ago and did some surveys and found it growing really well in an area that had been grazed. And then due to some constraints and conservation concerns for some local agencies, they removed the grazing, and there was a significant thatch layer that has now developed and built up. And in subsequent surveys, we haven't found any Gaviota Tar Plant in the ungrazed site. And then in the adjacent site just across the fence, where it's currently being grazed year-round, pretty much on a kind of rotational grazing system, there's a lot of Gaviota Tar Plants. When we were out this year, the ungrazed site had no tar plant, and just across the fence line, we counted probably about 600 tar plants just within about a 2-acre area. So it was doing really well. So we are working. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, okay. Oh, well, I think you're just going to go there. I was going to ask you, so do you have any kind of project objectives, or is there some number of population size of tar plant that you're aiming for?
Right now, we don't have a specific population size for tar plant that we're aiming for, but we're shooting for about 75% cover of native and naturalized species. And we're kind of restricted in our total, in our ability to set a target for tar plant due to some other agency constraints that we're working with. But we're hoping to get to similar population levels as we see on our reference site, which is right across the fence line. So like this year, we saw about 600 or so out there. So we're hoping for a similar level next year after we do our grazing.
Right. Okay. Now for the graze, so I take it that the grazing practice for the plant is basically you're just trying to remove. Now, explain to us a little bit about what your strategy is for using the grazing to benefit the tar plant. So when do you bring the animals in? How many do you use? And what are you, with the timing of the grazing, what specifically you're trying to affect on those annual grasses?
Yeah. So it kind of depends. Our Gaviota Tar Plant is more of a spring plant when it comes up. So we're going to try and bring the cattle in. We're going to base it on the amount of forage production out there. Depending on our stocking density, we do have, this is kind of a complicated management plan that we're working with because we have other success criteria we have to meet for percent cover and native cover. So we're also trying to balance a lot of different dynamics that way. But primarily for the Gaviota Tar Plant, we're going to basically bring the cattle in early before the tar plant really germinates and sets seed. And while the ryegrass is a really common plant out there, and we have some annual forbs that come up, like burr clovers and vetch and stuff that'll come up a little bit before the Gaviota Tar Plant does. So we're going to try and bring the cattle in before the Gaviota Tar Plant comes in and graze down some of the ryegrass and the vetch and the burr clover to reduce that competition and open up the soil and stuff for the Gaviota Tar Plant to set seed and start reproducing. So we'll bring the cattle in probably early spring, graze for a couple weeks at a higher density to try and knock the thatch down and then start removing some of the new growth. And then we'll pull them off and then hopefully let the Gaviota Tar Plant grow in and then set seed, and we'll bring the cattle back on in late summer to kind of remove some of that thatch so that next year we'll have less thatch and the Gaviota Tar Plant will be able to start growing earlier.
Great. Is this project on private land or public land?
It's on private land.
Okay. Have you guys had to interact with any of the state or federal agencies with respect to the managing the plant?
Yes, we've had quite a few interactions with state agencies primarily. So.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Great. All right. Let's see. Lavina, do we have any questions at this point on Katie's presentation?
We haven't had any come through the chat window yet. If you do have a question, out there in the webinar world, feel free to enter it, and we can certainly relay that to Katie.
Great. Katie, let's see. Now, I don't know. Are you online? Can you see the slides that I'm throwing up?
No, I'm not.
Okay, no worries. Okay, so
I can get to a computer quickly though if you need me to.
Nah, that's okay. I just took liberties of trying to help illustrate some of the areas and the plant and things that you were talking about. How about, would you like to take a few minutes to talk about the Carrizo Plain and some of your projects with some of the plants and animals out there?
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
I think we've got about maybe 5 or 6 minutes, so it'll have to be kind of compressed. But if you could at least kind of tell us a little bit about some of the projects you've been doing with endangered and threatened species out there, I think that'd be nice.
Yeah, that'd be great. So one of our other projects that we're working on is out on the Carrizo Plains, and it's associated with the Topaz Solar Farm, which is one of the biggest solar farms in the world right now. It's about 550 megawatt facility out there, and it's really unique setup because the initial design of the project and the project goals was to basically maintain vegetative cover underneath the solar panel to create San Joaquin kit fox habitat out there, and then to basically continue the agricultural practices that were used on the site previously to the solar development. So that was primarily grazing out there. So through this, we've basically reseeded the whole like 3,300 acres of solar panels that are out there. All have a vegetative floor, so there's grass and native species growing underneath all the panels out there. And to manage that, we've brought in several bands of sheep that come out there. So we have, this past year we had over 3,000 sheep on the site from about April through August. And we're using the sheep to manage the habitat for the San Joaquin kit fox, which is a federally endangered species. And then we have several plant species that occur out there too that are endangered and special status species. So the grazing is basically a way to maintain the agricultural uses on the solar farm, and then also manage the habitat out there for the kit foxes, and then help the solar company who owns it out there, which is BHE Renewables. They basically have they have a more cost-effective way to manage their vegetation on the site, because they're using the sheep to also work for weed control as well as several invasive weed species out there. So the sheep are providing several different services out there, from vegetation management to habitat management, and then a reduced cost because they're not having to mow all of the grass that's occurring and growing out there. That's kind of a very brief overview, and I'd be happy to go into more details on any of that if we have time.
Right. How about really quick on the bands of sheep? Can you tell us a little more detail about what time of year do the sheep come in to graze, and then what are the objectives of the solar company in using the sheep around the solar facility?
Yeah. So the sheep come in as soon as we start getting growth in the spring, which kind of fluctuates depending on the year. That's usually out on the Carrizo Plains. It's between March and May when they start to come in. We bring them in all at once, and the project site's 3,300 acres. So it's a really big project site, and we graze them in like a high-density rotational pattern. So they're being moved every 2 to 3 days throughout the whole project. So we start 3 different bands of sheep out there pretty much at 3 different areas on the project and move them every 2 to 3 days. So it's really high intensity and really labor intensive too. So we have full-time shepherds out there that move the sheep every 2 to 3 days to make sure that we're not overgrazing areas and that we're reaching our objectives. And some of the objectives that BHE, who owns the solar farm, was hoping to achieve by using the sheep was primarily to manage the vegetation height and to maintain the optimum function of the solar arrays out there, and then to manage their fire risk by reducing their fuel load, and then also to manage for the San Joaquin kit fox habitat. That was one of the primary goals as well. So
can you say a couple of words about what kind of habitat or habitat structure the kit foxes seem to prefer?
Yeah, they seem to prefer grazed areas, so where the vegetation is about 4 to 8 inches tall, because their primary prey is either the ground squirrels or gophers and small amphibians that are out there. So when the grass gets too tall and too dense, they can't see their prey anymore, and then they're more vulnerable to being preyed upon by other species out there. So they prefer the lower grass where it's been grazed to about 4 to 8 inches, and your RDM is probably at that point around 500 to 600 pounds per acre out there. So after the sheep go through, the vegetation height's reduced, and our RDM is within our target range.
Right. For all those non-Californians out there, RDM stands for residual dry matter. That is the leftover annual grass material at the end of the grazing season. Great. All right. Well, let's see. Levina, let me ask you this question: is Pete Van Horn online now?
I am. If you can hear me.
I can hear you now. Excellent. Good. Okay, so let's take one more minute or so. If anyone has any questions about for Katie about the solar farm and grazing in the kit fox habitat, or the grazing for the tar plant, we'll take a question, give her a chance to answer it. But if there are no questions, we will roll on to amphibians with Pete Van Horn.
So, Marc, a couple of questions did come through the chat box. I believe that Claudia Ingram's question might have been answered already, but she was asking what about the sheep grazing is best for the fox, and I think that Katie spoke to that pretty well. And then another question came in from Roxanne. Is there evidence that the SJ kit fox is using the farm currently? Were there pre-construction surveys indicating prior use levels?
Yes, actually we have. That's another one of our really big projects on the site is we have radio collared all of the kit foxes, and we do telemetry every day for them, and they are currently using the entire project site actually. So their distribution prior to construction shows them using the whole 3,300 acres, and then after construction their use patterns haven't changed. And we actually this year had a pair of kit foxes actually den using one of the artificial dens that we built for mitigation out there. They actually denned inside the den that we built for them and successfully raised, I think it was 3 pups out there right in the solar panels. So there's been no effect that we can see to the kit fox distribution from the solar panels.
And I can add that there were a number of charming photographs taken during the construction phase of the kit foxes hanging out on the equipment and everything. They were right in the middle of the whole construction zone.
They were making construction challenging. We had lots of measures in place to protect them, so we spent a lot of time monitoring, making sure they were safe.
All right. Are there any more questions?
Not at this time. I think it would.
All right.
We could move forward.
All right. Great. Katie, thank you very much for taking your time this morning with us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. All right, so the next person I would like to introduce is Pete Van Horn. And Pete, you know what? I didn't manage to get my slides finished up for you this morning, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to show and tell very much. But to tell you what, why don't you hop in and introduce yourself to everyone? And I've asked Pete to take a few minutes to talk about the management of a couple of endangered amphibians in California, the California red-legged frog and the tiger salamander.
Hi, everybody. I'm Pete Van Horn. I'm a range ecology consultant, and I work for Larry Ford and other range consultants. And yeah, I've done a lot of work like at the project level with red-legged frogs and tiger salamanders. And Larry and I and some other folks also put together the guidelines on managing rangelands to benefit these 2 species. So we've looked at it more from a range-wide scale as well.
All right. Well, so I know you guys did put together a publication on recommendations. So can you talk a little bit about the life cycle and habits of the red-legged frog, and we'll take from that, move it into grazing management practices that have been recommended for the management of those amphibians?
Yeah. Okay. So the red-legged frog and tiger salamander both breed every winter, early spring, and whatever. Well, I'll start with the frog. They like stock ponds and freshwater marsh, anything that's kind of 2 to 12 feet deep that has a mix of emergent vegetation and open water. And then after that, they'll scatter through the rangeland looking for other wet refuge, which could be another pond or just like shade under a coyote brush and kind of anything in between, like preferably like a spring or a seep, but we'll have a pretty wide tolerance. The tiger salamander, will, when they leave those ponds, they will go and look for ground squirrel burrows or gopher burrows, and they'll live like 98% of their life underground, and then just come out to breed when they're adults every winter. And so going from that then, for the frog, really what you're doing mostly is trying to provide the right habitat at the breeding sites and moist refuge areas for the dry season. For the salamander, it's about having the right kind of breeding pond and then making sure that there's plenty of ground squirrels or pocket gophers. I can just sort of go from there, but do you have specific questions?
No, at the moment. Why don't you go ahead and just, let's see. Yeah, so Kier, why don't you, if you've got anything else you can add to the grazing management practices, times of year, seasons, are there any recommendations on stocking rates or any conditions that the livestock managers are trying to aim for in terms of the habitat structure in and around the ponds?
Yeah, okay. So they're a good contrast, the two species, because they have different needs, different preferences, and so it really, depending on that, it changes how you are trying to look at the landscape as a range manager. The red-legged frog likes a mix of vegetated cover and open, both on the landscape and especially in a breeding pond. And so like a breeding pond that had cattails from anywhere like about a third to about a half or a little more, emergent cover of cattails or things like that is great. They can tolerate a little less or a little more, but if it's completely open, not enough places for them to hide, it's totally choked out, it's too cold for their young to develop. And so, whereas the tiger salamander just really likes open water. They can tolerate some cattails, but if it's just completely open, muddy little bomb crater, they can really thrive in that. And so really, when you're trying to manage that breeding pond, you're managing mainly for the cover. Like that's, I think, consensus among the species experts, like where there was agreement was just like that's really important, and there was clear consensus on what the objectives are, is to have the right amount, right mix of open and emergent. And so grazing is a great tool for that. With the red-legged frog, if you've got a mix of emergent cover, then just keep doing what you're doing. If you've got too much emergent vegetation, then you would maybe want to have more summer grazing or fall grazing when there's not a lot of green feed in the fields, and they'll spend more time in the pond, spend more time eating cattails. If you don't have enough emergent cover, then you'd want to reduce grazing pressure, especially in that spring, fall season, or put up fence to exclude maybe a third or half of the pond. Whereas with tiger salamanders, it's a lot easier. You're not really worried about not having enough cover. So really any time of year, grazing is less of an issue there. There's a few other issues that we get into in the guidelines, but it's a lot more nuanced and sometimes a little more controversial. So at least for now, I'm going to skip over to the rangelands outside of those breeding sites. Tiger salamanders in particular are really associated with short grasslands. But from talking to the species experts, it doesn't seem like that's necessarily like directly because that's what they care about. It seems like it's probably that's what ground squirrels care about. There's no like hard and fast rule of what that is, but I imagine managing to the low end of minimum RDM, you want enough out there to protect the soil from erosion and have a decent mix of annual species. But that low end is probably what's preferred by ground squirrels. And so if you're managing for ground squirrels, really any time of year or any sort of approach to grazing is okay, generally as long as it's keeping a lid on that rapid spring growth. But you could do it like just heavy grazing just in the spring, or it could be more light to moderate grazing year round. There's really not a grazing regime that doesn't have tiger salamanders up there. With the red-legged frog, they do need some shrubs or willows or something to take refuge under. So especially if there's not a lot of ponds for them to hang out in during the dry season. And so there again, if you've got some riparian corridors that are looking like they're getting hit kind of hard, you'd want to ease off, reduce grazing pressure in the summer, especially summer and fall. But if you had plenty of willows, plenty of vegetated seeps and springs, then just keep doing what you're doing. That's all I got off the top of my head, Marc.
That's good. So let's see, Lavina, have we had any questions come in so far?
None yet.
Okay, great. Well, let's see. And have we heard anything from Heidi or Tiffany yet?
Heidi or Tiffany, if you're on the phone, would you please check in with us?
Great. So, Pete, the red-legged frogs and the tiger salamanders have both gotten a lot of attention over the years. Can you say anything about what you know of some of the practice difficulties that grazers have had in implementing some of the grazing recommendations in these habitats? Have there been any?
Definitely, yeah. So a few come to mind. Maybe the most important one is just that stock ponds are really probably the most important type of breeding site. So both of these species are really concentrated in the coast ranges on ranches, and a lot of the natural breeding sites like slow-moving streams or vernal pools, a lot of that has been destroyed or altered in some way. And so stock ponds really are the core kind of breeding site. Most of the stock ponds in California, or at least that part of California, were put in 1950s, 1970s, and they're starting to fail. And so fixing them is really expensive and takes like 4 to 8 permits. And so that's been a real challenge. That's something that NRCS and some RCDs have worked a lot on and started to make a lot of progress on. So that's just a huge battle to me. The other thing is just there's just a lot of disagreement among biologists on how to manage these species, especially I think the red-legged frog. And when we worked on our book project, the impression I got is that the frog is a bit of a generalist. You can find it in freshwater marsh out on the coast. You can find it in really dry interior hills where it gets like 9 inches of rain a year. And so the biologists working in these different environments have really different, often, attitudes about grazing. A lot of the projects that people work on, people would take a range practice like, okay, summer grazing or high intensity short duration, and they would run it by a biologist. And a biologist would say, oh, that's great, that's bad, or you have 2 biologists saying 2 different things. And from working on our guidelines project, I think it really emphasized the value of like a targeted grazing approach, where instead of taking your practice list first and then asking biologists about it, you talk to your biologists and you find out, okay, what do these species need? Okay, so they need somewhere wet to hang out in the summertime, and that somewhere wet to hang out, depending on how much rainfall you're getting and what the trees are like, that can come a lot of different ways, and how it is at your particular site is going to affect what your appropriate management practices can be. So just not putting the cart before the horse, I guess, so to speak, really figuring out your biological objectives, looking at your site with those objectives in mind, and then trying to figure out what are the practices, approaches that are going to work for your site. So change in philosophy, I don't think that switch has really happened yet, but hopefully it will. There's a lot of biologists working on mitigation projects that don't have range background, so it's a slow process.
Got it. Thank you. All right, Lavina, I can't see the message board, so have we had any other questions come in so far?
So far, all is quiet. If any of you out there in the webinar would like to ask a question of Pete, please feel free to enter it into the chat box. We'll relay it to Marc and Pete.
All right. Pete, so what's the current recommendation about stock ponds? So I know that back in a few years ago when I was working with the red-legged frogs, one thing that was often talked about was trying to drain out stock ponds during the season because of bullfrog predation. Is that still something that people are trying to do?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely it is. So, but again, that's something where if you ask 3 people, you get 3 different answers. It depends on if you think that can work. So if you've got if you're just surrounded by other occupied, other ponds or creeks that have bullfrogs, it might not be worth your time to try to control the bullfrog population. Red-legged frogs can coexist with bullfrogs if there's enough emergent vegetation, and so maybe just making sure that they can try to coexist is the best you can do. If you're at a place where there's not a lot of sources, bullfrog sources around, then especially if it's like a regulatory project, then there often is a lot of pressure to drain it several years in a row, and then just keep draining it periodically, maybe forever. And that draining would kind of a narrow window in the late summer, early fall. Red-legged frogs don't really finish metamorphosizing until July or August, and then we get our first rains, and spring start filling ponds up, anywhere from August to October. And now we've got more and more concern about hybrid tiger salamanders as well. So it's the same thing. The hybrids seem to do much better in perennial ponds. So if you're in an area that's getting invaded by those hybrid genes, there's more and more pressure to drain those ponds every summer or two.
So Pete, this is Lavina. I did have a question come in through the chat box. Christy Wyckoff asks, at the federal level, the 4D rules allow for ongoing stock pond maintenance. She's asking, what are the permits required by the state?
For the state, there's often the 1602 requirements. There can be regional water board requirements. There's often county grading requirements. One of the big things is water rights. That maybe in the last 5 years that has really started getting enforced by the Department of Water Rights and the California Fish and Wildlife. A lot of these ponds don't have water rights, and a lot of ranchers aren't interested in putting their necks out at this point to get them. If you've got Farm Bill money or other federal money helping to fund the project, then you still do need some sort of U.S. Fish and Wildlife permit. So, but they've been pretty helpful trying to facilitate that one way or another.
Okay, one other question for you, Pete. Another viewer asks, is there a need to minimize grazing impacts, such as soil compaction or collapsed burrows that may negatively impact threatened endangered species habitat?
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, there's, I guess, no quick answer. So with tiger salamanders, in vernal pools, it seems like that compaction is actually there's been some research showing that compaction by sheep or cows is important in maintaining the vernal pool inundation period. Also, grazing of the annuals in the vernal pool seems to be important. In the stock ponds, it's a little more controversial. Turbidity for tiger salamanders can be very important, and so if you have a clear shallow pond, you probably do want cows or sheep mucking it up. They can step on egg masses. That was definitely a controversial thing. some very experienced biologists said it just hardly ever happens. Others said it's a real risk, and I just don't think we had a resolution on that to like camp any egg masses. Compaction, I'm thinking really specifically for the two amphibians right now. Compaction issues, I guess, really don't come to mind except for that vernal pool issue. I think the tiger salamanders, they don't, in general, seem too sensitive to potential negative habitats. For red-legged frogs, definitely heavy summer grazing or year-round grazing can do a number on willows and other important sources of shade. Another thing is ground squirrel control, and so just making sure there's different methods of ground squirrel control that can wipe out every living thing in the Burrows system, and obviously those methods aren't compatible with either of these species.
That's because the red-legged frogs commonly will use ground squirrel burrows for estivating, right?
Yeah, the tiger salamanders in particular will live there, but especially if you're in a place that doesn't have a lot of great kind of shrubby, moist refuges, red-legged frogs will also just hang out in burrows.
Okay. Great.
Okay, Marc. No other questions coming in at this time.
Sounds good.
Hey, Marc,
Okay.
This is Tiffany. We're here.
Hey, Tiffany. Awesome.
Yeah.
Glad to have you. All right, so we're going to move over to sage-grouse then. So I'd like to introduce Tiffany Russell and Heidi Ramsey. So Tiffany is with another conservation organization in California called Point View Conservation Science. And Heidi, if she's there, is with the USDA NRCS. She's a range management specialist. And so, awesome. So we're going to roll over into sage-grouse. We're going to finally get into an animal species that perhaps some of you outside of California actually have some familiarity with. So as strange as it may seem, California actually has sage-grouse. We've got the westernmost populations, I think. We can fight over that between Oregon and California and Washington. But anyway, Tiffany and Heidi have been working with the sage-grouse population in northeastern California, and they offered to step on and say a few words about their project. So take it away. And so, let me do this. Why don't you give kind of a brief background to the buffalo skedaddle area and what's going on there with that sage-grouse population, and what's happening now with trying to organize some efforts to restore some of the habitat in the bird populations.
Yeah, okay, so the buffalo skedaddle is our population management unit, and like Marc said, we're in northeast California, kind of north of Reno, and our population goes into Nevada. And so we have a local working group that has been around for 10 to 15 years working on sage-grouse issues, and it includes, the BLM, NRCS, private landowners, permit holders, other interested parties, the Fish and Wildlife agencies, all that sort of thing. And our populations have been declining over the past 50 years or so. And it obviously became an issue of concern when they were petitioned to be listed. So this group kind of got together to write a conservation strategy to keep the bird from being listed. And so in recent history, our population has, the largest effect on it has been a 300,000 acre fire called the Rush Fire. It burned in 2012. It's the second largest fire in California's history. And so it was quite a large area that it burned. And in our areas, we have a lot of issues with cheatgrass coming in, and the reduction of the sagebrush cover was a significant impact on the sage-grouse populations here. So that's kind of been, our group has gotten together to try to restore areas and really prioritize where we spend our money, talking about a landscape bird that can move huge distances within a year, within, a couple months. They move around a lot. So it's, you kind of have to manage for it on a landscape scale. So that's kind of why our group has gotten together. So that's kind of, the background on our group here. in terms of grazing, we are in discussions. We actually just today we got out of a meeting 10 minutes ago with the BLM, and we had a permit holder here and talking about grazing strategies on the BLM landscape level of their permits and their pastures and allotments on how we can manage for sage grouse on that kind of level, which is very difficult. So I don't know, Marc, if you want us to go into kind of the grazing plans or.
Sure. Why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about the kind of habitat that you have, because all right, so sage grouse do inhabit sagebrush, steppe, grasslands. That's fine. But in northeastern California, we've got one area so I've been working with the Clear Lake sage grouse population, and that's heavily western juniper invaded. I don't know if the buffalo skedaddle is nearly so heavily invaded as that, but tell us about the plant species that are common there and what the habitat structure is like, and then what you're trying to aim for with the grazing practices.
Okay, so our habitat structure, we do have a lot of juniper that comes in on our cooler, moister soils and towards the western part of our population. So kind of coming off the mountains, we get a lot of juniper, and then on higher elevations, north-facing slopes on the eastern part of our population, we do get juniper coming in. Then we kind of move down into mountain big sagebrush, which those are kind of, again, higher elevation areas. You get a lot of blue bunch wheatgrass, Idaho fescue in those areas, and it tends to be just more productive in general. Unfortunately, the majority of our population is kind of in lower elevation, drier soils, warmer soils, and there we get Wyoming big sagebrush, and we get species more like squirrel tail or Poa secunda or cheatgrass in those kind of lower elevation areas. And so that's kind of a lot on our eastern half of our population where that rush fire burned. Those are kind of the main species there. And then we do, of course, have antelope bitterbrush, mountain mahogany across the area and select parts of the population area. Heidi, do you want to add?
Well, I think Tiffany covered it pretty well as far as what we have with plant species. Basically, we touched a little bit about the fact that it was a landscape scale bird, and the reason that it's a landscape scale bird is because it needs different type of habitat in different parts of its life cycle. So when we're talking about doing grazing management, we have to think about all the different times that the bird is going to be using a specific area, whether they're going to be doing their mating rituals in an area called the lek, which is L-E-K. They use those areas. From there, we have early brood rearing areas, nesting areas after that, and then early and late brood rearing. And then we have also winter habitat. So the reason these birds move around so much is because they need that much area to find different types of areas and different structures to use.
Yeah, so just to get into that a little bit more, when we're talking about the lek area, that can be almost anywhere, but it just needs to be open so that the birds display, the males display on the lek to attract females. And then they move to nesting areas, which are adjacent to the leks, but that's where they need that sagebrush cover and an understory of grasses to protect them from predators, from both aerial predators and ground predators. So we want to provide, bunch grasses, tall grasses around the nest for cover for the birds. And then basically the chicks will, once they hatch from the nest, they walk to adjacent areas to feed, and at that point they're eating mainly ants and other insects. Once they're able to fly, this is where the birds really start moving. They can move pretty far away from where their nests are, and they move to meadows and springs and alfalfa fields, areas where there's a lot of insects and forbs. And the forbs become a huge part of their diet, so that's something that we always want to try to manage for with grazing is forbs in these meadows and areas that stay green late into the summer. So once, they need a lot of protein when they're young, and so they try to fatten up, and then when they're going into fall and winter and we're kind of losing the forbs and insects, that's when they rely a lot on sagebrush. And so they eat sagebrush for the majority of the year, and the main constraint on them being able to eat sagebrush is availability of just the sagebrush being there, but also snow cover. So in the wintertime, you want there to be areas that sagebrush is above the level of the snow. So those are kind of the seasonal habitats that we manage for with our grazing plans.
Quickly, there was a question from the webinar audience from Kayla Burek. It says, in times of extreme drought, do ranchers provide supplemental feed opportunities to keep grazers away from key nesting, brood-rearing habitats?
I don't know of anyone doing that. A lot of the land we're working on is BLM land, and so the BLM kind of sets the AUMs for that area. And like after the fire, they definitely reduced grazing in certain areas, and if there's extreme drought, they'll reduce grazing. So on private land, landowners are feeding more and reducing their herd size. I mean, there's all sorts of drought strategies that they're using, but on the BLM, it's kind of, it's sort of dictated by what they think will meet the habitat needs. So we haven't seen that much in terms of that out here. But the one thing to think about here is, we do want to provide nesting cover. We want there to be perennial grasses. We want to reduce the risk of cheatgrass. So our grazing strategies are trying to reduce annuals, enhance perennials in the nesting areas. But when we go to the brood rearing areas, we really do want grazing in our meadows and springs, not to affect the hydrology of those springs or, create erosion issues or anything like that, but to allow forbs to come into those areas and compete with the grasses. So we've gone to meadows where there hasn't been any grazing, and we don't expect sage grouse to be using that. A lot of ranchers will tell you the grouse follow the cows around, and that's not always true, but in certain areas, in meadows and springs, I think that is true. So, any other questions? Or we could talk a little bit about how we structure our grazing plans quickly, and then...
Yeah, I'd like you to do that.
Okay. Well, so Heidi and I'm a biologist, Heidi's a range specialist, and we work together on all our grazing plans that are specifically targeted for sage grouse. And usually the first thing we start out with is identifying what time of year we expect sage grouse to be using the area of our ranch or whatever size we're working on of a grazing area, and what kind of habitat that is. So we talk about whether it's nesting habitat, whether it's lekking habitat, whether it's early brood rearing, whether it's late brood rearing, or whether it's wintering habitat. So that's kind of how we start, is mapping those areas on whatever ranch we're working on, and then so we know when to expect the birds and what habitat we're trying to manage for. Do you want to go into more after that, Heidi?
Well, basically, I think that in a lot of our areas, we've been able to work with ranchers that will necessarily just defer their grazing until, after at least the early brood rearing period, and then that way, there's really not going to be a lot of disturbance. But
where there hasn't been, where they can't defer, one thing that we're trying on several of them is dividing up into different pastures. So we want to leave an area every year, like 20% is kind of the number that a lot of the NRCS grazing plans use of the whole ranch for nesting every year, but we change up that pasture, wherever that is, every year. So we're leaving a nesting area, but they're still able to graze in other areas, but then we're changing up the season of use every year. And then, the other thing to consider with our grouse plans is we really want to maintain the integrity of the system on the long term. So that's where we start looking at areas of weed issues. And then if we have something like that, I also have another plan where we're trying to time our grazing every spring for when the cheatgrass is greening up. So putting them in there for 2 to 3 weeks when the cheatgrass is coming in. And sure, it might reduce some of the cover because that is a nesting area, but we're concerned about the long-term health of that ecosystem. So if there's any way we can give an advantage to the perennial grasses, that's what we're trying to do. And then the other thing is if we have brood-rearing habitat on there, we are trying to get grazing in there. Able to, if we can manage for a certain area that is a brood-rearing habitat area or a meadow, trying to get some grazing in there during the summer. As much as I know, there isn't a lot of direct conflict between grouse and cows in terms of trampling or, the grouse leaving where there's cows. So we're not really worried about that as much. We're just trying to maintain the habitat overall. So those are kind of things we consider and how we structure a lot of our grazing plans for sage grouse. Are there any questions?
There was a question that just came in. Are there other species at risk on these ranches that you also take into consideration when designing the management plans? And if so, how are you managing for multiple species at risk?
Well, the great thing about Northeast California is agriculture has been the main land use up here, and we have very few threatened and endangered species. So because we still have maintained these large intact landscapes and we don't have pressure of development, and there's not, the soils and everything aren't really good for intensive agriculture in most of the area in the growing season. So we really don't actually have any other species that we're really managing for besides, kind of the suite of sagebrush obligates that go along with sage grouse. So we see that managing for sage grouse really is helping a lot of other bird species and reptile species that may have, in the long run, if we keep degrading our sagebrush habitats, they'll be, they will be listed at some point if that happens. So, and basically how you do that is, again, kind of maintaining your shrub cover. A lot of people do like to manage the sagebrush, and that can be appropriate in certain areas, but making sure you kind of have a certain mosaic of sagebrush existent will keep your other sagebrush obligates there. But yeah, and we don't really have any other Tierney species that we're, or even special, sensitive species that we're really managing for that would be at cross purposes to sage grouse or anything like that.
Do you guys have pygmy rabbits up on the skedaddle?
There are rumors of them, but
yeah. Okay. Levina, any other questions? I know we're kind of getting over time now.
None else are coming in.
Okay. Well, I hate cutting off because this conversation can go on for a while yet. But
yeah, we could talk about this forever.
I know. I really appreciate both of you taking time out of your day and dashing over after the meeting to catch us up. It was great. And everyone who's joined the webinar today, thank you. I hope you've gotten some ideas, or at least had a little bit of an opportunity to kind of see what some other people have been doing. We are going to make those publications that I found that had some guidelines and recommendations for the management of a few different kinds of Tierney species, principally wildlife, and make those available on the website, so you can go and pull some of those down and have a look at them. I know Pete Van Horn, who spoke about the red-legged frog and tiger salamander. He was one of a group who wrote a publication with specific guidelines for managing those particular amphibians. And so, if you'd like to look at what some other people have put together for grazing prescriptions and guidelines, that could be useful to you. There are a number of publications for sage grouse and grazing recommendations there in those areas. And every year it seems like there are more publications that